All right, today we got a little quick discussion on catalytic converters and a couple of stories about some back pressure and that kind of thing. And I just was going to show you, I had this catalytic converter that I cut a side out of it, just use it, show it to the students. You know, that's your honeycomb in there. That was a healthy catalytic converter we got off of a junk car. And the around here, I don't know if you guys have been having problems with that where you are, but there's just enough precious metals in these catalytic converters to make them worth something. And even now, people will get under there with these motorized saws and they'll cut the catalytic converter off of a vehicle that's real easy to cut it off of. And there was a guy I was talking to at church the other day, and he said he has a truck that he doesn't drive very much, and he went out there and fired it up and made a lot of exhaust noise, and he looked under there, somebody cut the catalytic converter off. Now these channels here are hundreds of them per square inch, that where the exhaust gas has to go through those little channels there, and on the inside of each channel is a really thin layer of precious metal that whenever it reaches temperature, it acts as a catalyst and it changes the quality of these exhaust gases, and that's pretty much what these catalytic converters do. And the cool thing about that was what they had to go through to do this. Whenever they first came up with the notion that vehicles had to have catalytic converters, it was in 1970, and it just scared the daylights out of some of the manufacturers. Lee Iacocca said that, you know, if the government requires these on cars, you know, Ford was going to shut down and couldn't build any more cars and all that. But when you think about what they had to do to make this, they had to take this clay, and it had to be roughly the kind of like newspaper pulp in the way it was, and then they had to extrude it, and then furthermore it actually had to be heated up so that they could do that without, you know, cracking and breaking it and make the channels crooked. And so then they also had to find a way to put a really, really fine layer of these precious metals in there in all of those channels so that they wouldn't flake up and come off when they were getting hot and cold and hot and cold and hot and cold. But what they eventually found was they found this special clay over in Georgia that had these fibrous needle-like little tiny pieces in it, and they figured out a way to make all this happen. The cool thing about it was the development of the catalytic converter didn't involve routine applications of previously understood principles, but it amounted to something like a miracle because Corning engineers had two major breakthroughs, a new process and a new material that had never existed before to make catalytic converters. We don't often think about just how incredibly special these things are. Now, a lot of the times I have seen people that would buy brand new vehicles and just jerk the catalytic converter off of them and put, you know, run the exhaust out. And that only works in states where you don't have emission testing, mandatory emission testing too, by the way. But for my purposes, I typically have a tendency to leave the thing alone, you know, as far as the emissions, the catalytic converter and all that. We used to have some people who would buy brand new Ford vehicles, Mustangs or whatever, and the first thing they would do was rip off all the original injectors and the throttle body and all of that, and then they would put a whole bunch of fancy-nancy hot rod stuff on there that was really expensive and try to just totally re-engineer the vehicle and make it really special for them. And then they would want to come in and grouse and complain that there was a check engine light on and they wanted something done about it. But whenever you change the size of the throttle body and put different injectors on there, and even sometimes put a different engine controller on there, you know, of course they didn't usually do that. They just changed all of the hardware on the motor that they knew how to change. But you know, the emission warranty wouldn't pay to fix it after they've replaced so many of the components with aftermarket hot rod stuff. And it was just really something. Also, what a lot of people don't know is if you are doing some kind of a modification, even as like an idle speed adjustment or something to some of these, that's not outlined in the service literature, then that makes you liable for big fines, not only the shop, but you, if you change stuff. And the EPA guy, you know, of course I haven't seen a lot of EPA guys swarming around here, but what we were always told was if the EPA starts coming and looking at work orders, and you put on a work order that you made some kind of adjustment that was not specified as a authorized adjustment by the OEM, then you're subject to a $10,000 fine per incident, and so is the shop that you work at. So that's something that, you don't need to take it lightly when we're talking about disabling the ignition on these things. Now, if one is old, if it's a really old vehicle, they had for years around here, they had these pipes. They called them a tri-pipe, and what it was supposed to do was, if you thought your catalytic converter was stopped up, you could take the catalyst out and put one of these pipes in there just to see if that made it run better. Of course, the notion was, if you pulled one of those off, and I would see them. They call them tri-pipes, and if you put it on there and it ran a lot better, and you knew the catalytic converter was bad, then you would basically just leave the tri-pipe on there. I guess a lot of people were doing that. It was funny to me how the service manager that worked when I worked over there for a while, he was one of these people that what my wife always called stirring up the puppies. He was constantly going through the shop, saying, pick this up, clean that up, get that taken care of. And there was these recalls that we had on some late 80s model cars. I think it was late 80s, maybe early 90s. And we were supposed to remove it was late 80s, because it was these little LTDs and Grand Marquis. And we were supposed to remove those catalytic converters and replace the entire exhaust system with a brand new exhaust system with new catalyst. And then they wanted the old catalyst back, probably because of all that precious metal, and they didn't want the shop selling them to salvage yards and getting $75 or $100 per converter and making a big windfall. So what we'd have to do was cut with a high-speed saw. With a abrasive saw, we would cut the catalyst out of there, put them in Corker sacks, and send them back to Ford. That was required. If you didn't, they charge you for the whole brand new exhaust system. And that service manager would walk through the shop, and he would see where people had swapped out the exhaust system, but they hadn't yet cut the catalyst out of those things yet and sent them back. And so he would have one of the guys that was a shop cleanup guy to cut those catalysts out of there and put them in the bags and take them into the parts room so they could get signed off the ticket. He was going through there doing that, and he did that regularly, because a lot of people, the last thing they wanted to do was fool with cutting those cats out of those pipes, so they have exhaust systems laying around in there. And so he goes and says, if somebody was working on, there was cars, just lift after lift lined up with all kinds of cars on it, and he had one of those cleanup boys cutting the catalyst out of some exhaust systems and take them in there. And this guy that was working on a police car that had pulled the transmission out of it turned around to get his exhaust, put it back on, and the service manager had the cleanup boy cut the catalyst out of that police car exhaust system. And so the shop had to pay for a brand new, and that was expensive, brand new police car exhaust system for that cop car, because it wasn't a part of that recall. And since the exhaust was laying on the floor, it got caught up in that. That was funny as all get out. And on that, I'll tell that story another day, but on the SBDS machine, if anybody of you are familiar with that, I figured out a way that I could boot that thing up on a floppy drive and type my own little special service messages, but I'll talk about that another time. I don't want to use the time on that today. But basically what you're doing here, what you got coming in, you got HC, NOx, and CO going in here, and you got two oxygen sensors just looking at the catalyst that's closest to the engine now. You don't have oxygen sensors looking at this one. Well, coming out of here, you've still got HCCO, but you've got nitrogen now. See, it broke the nitrogen up. You got some oxygen here too that I didn't put letters for. But anyway, this oxygen and nitrogen are split apart, and then it comes out of here and goes in here. This used to be they put all this in one catalyst. They call it a three-way catalyst. A two-way catalyst just handled HC and CO, as I remember, and then NOx was the other one. And so if you got a 5-gas analyzer, you're going to be analyzing your HC, your CO, your NOx, and your oxygen, and so on and so forth. Okay, so here's your, they go into this catalyst and they come out as CO2, H2O, N2, and O2. That's what comes out. Now you make a gallon of water for every gallon of gasoline you burn. That's why when you crank it up, you see the steam coming out the pipe when it's cold. I talked about that before. But combustion products go in to be processed, and then you get CO2, nitrogen, water vapor, and oxygen leaving the pipe. The most significant contributor to greenhouse effect that they're always talking about is water vapor. The water vapor does almost all of this, and only 0.001% of water vapor is man-made. A distant second is CO2, and man only makes 0.1117% of CO2. Then, of course, you got your methane and your N2O and miscellaneous gases and all that kind of thing. As far as, these are not percentages in the atmosphere, they're actually percentages of contribution to greenhouse effect, or climate change, whatever you want to call it. All right, so the NOx light-off catalyst is the one they'll have an oxygen sensor above it and below it. It's the downstream O2 sensor. This is the one the downstream O2 sensor is watching. The downstream O2 sensor will be on that side. If you look down there, you'll see these will be really close to the manifold because they'll take an advantage of all this heat. This thing's got to get to a certain temperature pretty fast so it can start working quickly. And this is a light-off cat. It handles NOx and really gets really hot. Now you can have external impact, you got misfires, you've seen all this stuff before. You can pause this slide and read that. I'm not going to read all those bullet points to you. But any and all of this kind of thing can damage the catalytic converter. How many of the times have you ever had a mixture problem or something going on when you would see the catalytic converter get really, really, really red hot? Long years ago. You remember that stuff that happened back in the early days, make you wonder. I was working at this gas station, was talking about this GTO or Camaro or something, I don't know what it was. But anyhow, this thing, the exhaust did not have a catalytic converter because it was a late 60s car. And this thing had a muffler. The muffler on this car, when the engine running, would get so hot that it would smoke the carpet on the inside of the car. And so there was a guy who was a machinist up there at the machine shop in town that we used a lot for machine work. And had been a really, really, really good mechanic working at a Cadillac dealership over in a big town up the road for, before he went to be a machinist and all. And this guy was really sharp. And so we called him up and he says, well, you either got ignition timings off or you got a vacuum leak somewhere. And so we found a big vacuum leak over there that we hadn't noticed, and it cleared it right up. I'm not really clear as to why that made that muffler hot. It must have been everything. It must have been a perfect storm situation where everything kind of just came together. I mean, I'd love to be able to explain every last little nuance of every little thing that happened on everything. But sometimes you just do something that fixes the car, and you're not exactly sure why it was causing the problem it was causing. That's just life, You're not always going to have all the answers and be the fountain of all knowledge. But whenever it's working right, the chemical reaction taking place produces heat. The gases exiting the converter should be hotter than the gases entering the converter. But be careful with that, because a temperature gun test may not always tell the truth, particularly on one of these exhaust systems like I showed you earlier. If you're taking advantage of the heat coming right out of the combustion chambers, you may read a really hot light-off converter right there. It works better if you've got a converter that's mounted downstream enough to where there's a little bit of a slight amount of distance between where the exhaust is leaving the head and going into that converter. Because I've actually measured some of them where the light-off converter was right up there on the manifold, and it'll fool you because you'll shoot it with a temperature gun and you'll see a temperature hotter up there than you will coming out the back, because you're not actually able to measure it accurately, the gas that's actually going into the converter, because it's so close to the where the exhaust is coming out of the engine. The temperature gun sounds good, but it won't always tell the truth. Like for example, you may see some some numbers like that. One time also, it may give you numbers that seem to be accurate, and I'm backing that up so it doesn't brighten up so much. Anyway, we had, and I think I may have mentioned this previously, we had a Monte Carlo. It was like a 2000 model, 2001 model, something like that. And it had a power loss issue. And so what we managed to do, and I'm going to show you how we found that one in a minute, we actually measured with a temperature gun. And we checked it for vacuum, and we measured. And it was peculiar on that one because the rev limiter on that one, it would kick in at a lower RPM than what I was used to on cars I'd been used to working on, because at the time was really early in 2000. I'd worked on more Fords than I had Chevys. And on the Fords in those days, the rev limiter is a little higher than it is on the Chevys. Whenever you're not loaded, you're just gassing it, you know. And you know what I'm talking about. You hit the rev limiter, you know, it's kick the injectors off. Usually throw you a P1270 code or something like that because it hit the rev limiter or the speed limiter or whatever. Anyway, I shot that converter with a in front and behind with a temperature gun, and it was cooler in the front than it was behind. Technically, that's supposed to work. I don't like any test that's not a go, no-go test. If it's not a go, no-go test, I typically discard it as being unreliable. This is a vacuum gauge test. You can demonstrate what a vacuum test looks like on a catalytic converter by taking, you know, when you put the car in gear and you're brake torquing it a little bit. And if you have somebody hold the brake, lock the park brake and all that stuff, you know, don't do something that's going to cause you to get run over. I usually, when I'm brake torquing one and somebody's checking it, I like to put it in reverse if they're standing in front of the car. And I brake torque it in reverse. Now the transmission pressures are higher in reverse, but you can lock those park brakes good and solid. Mash the brake first, then lock the park brakes, because if it's got drum park brakes, the park brakes in the back will be locked better if you mash the service brake before you lock the park brake. All right, so put it in reverse, and you can give that thing some gas, and you'll see that needle, you know, leave the green, and it'll, when you put it in gear, it'll drop back into here, and then as you give it in gear with the engine loaded, it'll come back down here, it'll stay here. Now what it's supposed to do when the engine is not loaded and it's not in gear or anything, is when you rev it up to probably 2,000 RPM, it'll drop and then it'll come back up. That's what it's supposed to do. But if it goes down and stays down, as you're slightly giving it more and more throttle, you know that you've got the engine loaded because it can't breathe and it can't get the exhaust out the back. All right, and we've seen these right here. This sometimes this vermiculite blanket that's around this thing will start shedding, and it'll actually clog that up. If anybody back in the days when you could get leaded gasoline, if they got leaded gasoline and put in there, that lead would slowly start to coat that catalytic converter until it completely stopped it up. Well, I built this thing, and I think I've shown that to you before. I screwed this 18 millimeter plug out of where you get a new catalyst, and it'll have these 18 millimeter, these dandy little plugs a lot of the times in the places where the oxygen sensors go. I keep these things, and you can buy them too. You can actually buy these from Summit Racing and places like that. And I actually drilled and I tapped that, and I put a brake bleeder screw in there and made a little, you know, I drilled it all the way through, and then I tapped it up here so that the exhaust back pressure will be coming up through that brake bleeder screw, and I'll have a piece of silicone hose put on this. And we've actually troubleshot some vehicle, like if you've got even 5 pounds of exhaust back pressure, that's too much. It's supposed to be almost nothing. I mean, it ought to be right close to just not less than a pound of pressure is pretty normal. And we've had 5 pounds, and that be the problem. And like we had that on a Trailblazer, when like a 04 model, and we pulled it off, and then we actually got a converter and put back in there that was one of those Walker cats. Some people have had trouble with Walker cats. Personally, the Walker cats catalytic converters I've used, I haven't really had a problem. I've seen some other aftermarket cats that we had trouble with. I don't know if the Walker catalytic converters are the same quality they used to be, but typically if we put a Walker catalytic converter on there, it would do okay. One time at the Ford place, somebody found out they needed a catalytic converter because they was throwing a PO420 code or whatever. So they went over and had one put on in a muffler shop, and they brought it back, and it continued to throw the same code. The one they put on at the muffler shop was not doing the job. I mean, it was basically showing to be a bad catalytic converter still throwing the code, and it was a brand new aftermarket. I don't know what brand aftermarket it was, but it was put on over one of the local muffler chains. Now, back pressure testing, some of these muffler shops will do this. They'll drill a little 1/8 hole right there, and we've actually done this. Matter of fact, on that Monte Carlo I was talking about, we did this. Just because I knew muffler shops did this, and this is a kind of a go, no-go test. If a test gives you good results, then that's what I like to use. And so, actually, I put this 1/8 hole arrow in the wrong place. And excuse me for that. I built this really fast, and this was the last slide I did. That hole is supposed to be here. Now, if you're wanting to check and see if this one's clogged, you can drill a hole here. But that hole should be in front of the catalytic converter, not behind it. So forget about that. Put the hole here, not back here. And I didn't even realize that I had done that wrong until I looked at it and saw it just now. That's what happens whenever you're distracted. Yeah, anyway, what we did was, look at this, that little old gauge right there. We just held that silicone hose right up on that 1/8 hole. And this particular one, and this was at Monte Carlo, it actually pulled that needle all the way around there. This was some really nasty back pressure. Remember, I had done a temperature gun test on this one here, and it passed the temperature gun test. So that's something that I don't really trust anymore like I used to. You know, in extreme cases, if you see 500 degrees in front of the cat and 200 behind it, you might be able to trust it. In this case, we had a lower temp in front than we did behind it. So if it's doing its job, it's supposed to have hotter gas coming out the back and it's going in front. But that's Jesse. He was holding that thing. It was really hot under there, and I wanted to take a picture of that gauge, what it was doing. After what the muffler shops do is they take a 1/8 blind pop rivet and they put it in that hole, click, and they snap it. Don't hurt a doggone thing. I did one time hear something that really shocked me at one of the dealership mechanics that was at a school where I went in Atlanta or somewhere, I can't remember, it might have been Tallahassee, was talking about how he had decided to drain the gas out of a tank, and I guess it had a metal tank on it. And so to drain the gas out of this vehicle, he put a drain pan under it that he knew was big enough to hold the gas, and he drilled a 1/8 hole in the tank and just let the gas run out of that 1/8 hole. And then when he was through draining the gas out of the tank, he put a pop rivet in it. I've never before or since heard of anybody draining a gas tank by drilling a 1/8 hole and then putting a pop rivet in it when they were done. Unless it's a blind pop rivet, I don't even know how you could trust that. That just drove me nuts even thinking about that. Anyway, I'm not saying you should do that. I'm saying I was shocked that this guy was saying he had done that. All right, now this right here is an exhaust gas analyzer. We're looking at CO2, CO, O2, HC, and NOx. This one right here was on a catalytic converter that was on a Jeep we were looking at that had been gutted. And this is, look what we had for CO2, and we had CO, we had 27%, we had no oxygen there. We didn't have any hydrocarbons. That was interesting to me. But now the light-off cat was the one they had gutted, and we had 90 parts per million of NOx, and the lambda was at 0.992. All right, so this is what we found when we pulled the catalytic converter off. This is actually the chamber where we ought to have been looking at a brick there, but somebody had busted all that out of there and had put it back on there. And the doctor that owned this thing had us put a replacement cat on it that was the right one. We bought a bolt-on cat from the parts store for a few $100s, and we put it on there. With the new cat, we had these readings here. Believe it or not, we had 5 parts per million of hydrocarbons. We had 14.3% CO2, but lambda was dead on the money, which I thought was pretty darn cool. Anyway, that's how it looked. And this is one of those Kane 5-gas analyzers. It's really pricey. The thing cost about $5,000 or $6,000. And we had one over there at school because I bought some with some grant money I had. Because I think every shop really needs to have an exhaust gas analyzer if you're serious, particularly if you're in a state where they have mandatory emission inspections. Now this is the before and after scan tool shot of that. Before we swapped out the cat on that Jeep, we had this. We had this 1.1 and 1.2, 2.1 and 2.2. See how they were very well mirroring one another? They were both really, really active. After we put the catalyst on there, we ran another test with this thing, and we had a nice lazy signal coming at 1.2 and 2.2. So 1.1 and 2.1 were still active, but these were, and that's what you're basically looking for, is you want the one behind the catalyst, behind the light-off catalyst, to be lazy. But once again, you don't have one behind the HC and CO catalyst, the one behind it. You don't have a sensor back there. This was my 2006 Explorer. I've got a Android radio I put in here, and I got a little $10. I have that thing right here. Maybe I don't have it right here. Maybe I've got it somewhere else. Either that, or I think it's in my console in my Explorer. But the long and the short of it is, I put a little um, one of those little dongles, little blue one. I don't remember the number for it, but it doesn't matter. I put it in. It's compatible with this radio, and I could pull up this program going down the road, and I could select whatever I wanted it to show me. And this is what the oxygen sensor on my Explorer looks like as 1.1, and there's two. That's actually 2.2 and 1.1, but it doesn't matter. But you see what I'm talking about. See how lazy this one is, and how that one is. This is actually showing me EGR. That's evaporative, and long and short. But anyway, this is your catalyst temperatures. I would rather see Fahrenheit than Celsius, but that's about 1,300 degrees Celsius. That's what my cats were running on that one there, which is pretty doggone cool. Now here's a catalytic converter test if you've got an exhaust gas analyzer. If you don't, you just let this go in one ear, pick up speed, and go out the other, because you can't do it without an exhaust gas analyzer. So a good catalytic converter ought to be able to convert HC that's pumped through the engine while it's spinning. So you kill the ignition, you're spinning it over, the injectors are spraying, and there's unburned fuel going through the converter. Well, the converter, if it's really hot, because you've just shut the motor off and done this test really quick, it ought to be able to do this. This is how you test it. The catalytic converter's got to be completely warmed up, a couple of thousand RPM, long enough to get it really, really, really hot. You got a scan tool that tells you the temperature. You can get an idea, you know, if it's 600-700 degrees Celsius. Disable the ignition, but not the fuel delivery. You want it to spray fuel in there while you're spinning it over. If you push clear flood all the way to the floor, it's going to cut off the fuel. All right, the hot converter, engine spinning, ignition disabled, the fuel injector is working. The CO2 level should reach and maintain 12% within about 10 seconds. So it ought to be taking care of this, the hydrocarbons is going through there. This is just a brief test. If the CO2 level does not reach at least 12%, or the only spikes to 12% briefly, then the catalytic converter is weak. If you're wanting to check this, you know, like if you're in a place where you're having issues with this thing passing emission testing, you might want to do this test to see maybe if the catalytic converter is sort of on the verge or the cusp of failure, or that kind of thing. This little 85 little Marquis I bought for $550 in 2001 from a guy that worked at a parts store. My wife knew his wife because they worked together or something. She said, they got this car you need to go look at over there. And so I went to look at the car. Nice looking little car, you know. And I says, and the guy said, well, I can't get it to run right. And, you know, it has almost no power. It's hard to drive. And he had replaced, he worked at some parts store, some chain parts store. I don't remember where it was, AutoZone or somewhere. And he had spent $500 on parts trying to fix his car. He swapped out engine controllers, and he put idle speed control motor on it, and injectors, and I don't know, just everything he could possibly come up with. And so just looking at it, I didn't drive it or anything. I was just basically going to buy it, you know, without even looking at it all that close, if the price was right. And he was trying to, you know, get me to give him a pretty good little bit of money for it. Finally, his wife said, we'll take $500 for it, just to get rid of it. And so he stepped out of the way and let her make the deal. I gave him $550 and brought it home. And it had a bolt-on catalytic converter. This one here was one you could take some bolts off and get it off in your hand. And so I unbolted it, and the catalytic converter was clogged slam up. Well, I checked other stuff first, but I didn't buy any parts. And I made that catalytic converter into a tri-pipe by knocking all the crap out of it. And it drove and ran really good. Now, whenever I wound up letting my son drive it for a while, he didn't really like it. It burned a lot of gas, had a C5 transmission in it, and that little V6, and it was just, I don't know. And it also had that problem where the transmission would overheat and it would start boiling fluid out the fluid vent and just, you know, make a big mess on the cars that were out driving behind it and all that. And I changed the fluid, put a modulator valve, and put an external transmission cooler on it and fixed that. I sold it to a guy that was one of my students in the college. He was a little bit older than me, but he was used to buying cars and speculating on them. All right, so I had paid $550 for it. Didn't really spend much of anything on it except that little bit of the transmission work I did. And I told him I wanted $875 for it. And he says, no, he said, I'll give you $750, but I won't give you $875. I said, okay. Well, I didn't really care if I sold it or not, to tell you the truth. I wanted to jump into the bit to get rid of the darn thing. I could drive it if I needed to. And he says, so about a week went by, and he kept waiting me out, you know, and I just didn't ever mention it again. Finally, he came up and he said, I'm going to tell you something. He says, never in my life have I ever come up to another man's price when I was buying anything from him. but I'm going to come up to your price on this, and I'm going to give you what you're asking for this car. And I said, okay, you know, because I made $200 or $300 off of it anyway, you know. I mean, I made money off the thing. So he drove it for a while, cleaned it up some, and then he sold it. And I said, what'd you get for it? He didn't want to tell me. I said, come on, man. I said, I'm not going to, it doesn't bother me. He said, well, I'm afraid you might get mad at me. I said, I'm not going to get mad at you. I sold it to you. You paid me what I asked for it. Whatever you sold it for, he sold it for $1,875. Now, you got to remember, this was about 2001 or 2002. And so he went ahead and made him some money selling that car, but he was afraid to tell me what he sold it for. But I mean, if I've sold you the thing, I don't care if you sell it for $10,000. If I get my $875, I'm not going to be bothered by that. He was used to people that would get angry with him, apparently. So anyway, that was a little story there. Got another little story here. This 72 LTD that I had back in 1980, 81, and I was driving this thing one night, headed down. I was going down to where I worked down at Sabine. This was back in the when I worked down in Texas at that offshore services facility doing fleet maintenance. I'd drive along, and the car rode kind of low because you know how the suspension on these big old cars gets kind of weak and they ride a little close to the ground. And I went driving through the Gulf Oil Refinery. As soon as I cleared the Gulf Oil Refinery, and that's a long straight road, go over the intercoastal bridge, and then you head on out. I got on it as soon as I come out of the oil refinery, and stood on the throttle pretty good, picked up, but that thing suddenly sounded like it made these funky hissing noises, and I lost about 40% of my power, and it wouldn't go hardly at all. I mean, I was driving maybe 50 miles an hour, 45 is all I could get out of it. And you got to remember, this was before the catalytic converter days. So I drove that thing all the way down to, and I put it in the shop. First thing I did, I don't even remember why I was going down there to begin with. But when something like this happened, I had to fix it. The shop wasn't open at the time. I was going down there after hours. And I pulled it in there, I raised it up, I put it on jack stands because we didn't have any lifts down there. And let's see, before I put it on jack stands, I was checking the stuff on the engine and all. And I noticed the strange thing was, when I would throttle it up, with my hand over the carburetor, it would literally, gas would come up out of the carburetor and splatter on my hand. And I was thinking, wow, this is really something here. And the more I thought about that thing, the more I decided I would get in there and look at the exhaust just to see what I could see, because it was feeling like the engine couldn't breathe. So I jacked it up and I put the stands under it, and I got under there with a light, and I noticed that the pipes, it had a pipe on both sides. It was a Y pipe that went way back, and then it came together into a single exhaust. And on both sides of this pipe, this thing had run low enough, and it had gone across railroad tracks and stuff to where it had flattened the bottoms of these pipes, which then in of itself shouldn't be a big deal. But when I dropped the exhaust off of it, it ran really good, and all this splattering gas on my hands, it was loud, was gone away. And so these places where the pipe was flattened out on the bottom on both sides now, I cut those out of there with a hacksaw. And a power saw back then, so I just had to cut it with a hacksaw, and that's the way we did things back in the day. But what we had was, that pipe was laminated, and it had an inner layer that had been compromised by all this flattening out business. And on both sides, apparently at the same time, or I don't know, it may have happened on one side before it did the other, that exhaust had got underneath that inner laminate and had blown it up so that it did this, on that area right there. And so what I did, I actually had some pipe down there that was laying over there in a scrap pile that was just the right size, which was, just totally amazing. So I cut these sections of pipe out. And I wished I'd have saved them, or I wish I'd have took pictures of them or something, but I wasn't even carrying a camera, in the early 80s. I had a camera, but I didn't have it with me everywhere. But long and the short of it was, so what I did was I bolted. Now think about this. You got to weld some pieces of pipe in here to replace these, but you want your exhaust system to fit. Okay, so I took the exhaust system and I bolted it up here fairly snug so that the pipes were positioned just like they were going to be positioned on the car. And I used other jack stands and stuff to prop these up so that I could tack weld in a couple of places a piece of pipe that was going to replace this section that was messed up. So I tacked it, and tacked it, and I tacked it, and I tacked it, and basically I did all that with it bolted up like it was supposed to be. And then after everything was over with, I did that on both sides, and I lowered it down, and then I used my torch and my coat hanger, and because we didn't have a MIG welder down there, but I used my torch and my coat hanger to go all the way around that pipe and weld it in the front and the rear, because since I tack welded it in place with it up there like it was, I knew that it was exactly right. Now, when I got it bolted back up, it fit perfectly. You know, if you just lay it on the floor and put some pipe in there, it ain't gonna fit. You should know that. And we've had to do that with catalytic converters that we welded back in too, when we'd send them over to the welding department when I was in college. Long and short of it is, that took care of that problem completely, and I didn't have any issues with that after that. Well, that's about all I got for you today. I hope I didn't bore you to tears with this. You know, some of you probably knew an awful lot of what I had already said. I hope you learned something that you didn't know, because that's one of the reasons I'm here, hopefully, and also to tell some fun stories and have a good time. But I'll see you guys next time, and I thank you for watching.